Well, good evening. Thank you for your patience. I'm Wendy Luget, the University Librarian here at the University of Minnesota, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second in a season that we're now calling the Friends Forum, a series for curious minds. And tonight we are joined by cookbook author and chef Beth Dooley and novelist and avowed foodie J. Ryan Stradal, and I can think of no better antidote to the lousy weather outside to coming inside and talking about food. So tonight we're also marking the third Kirschner lecture honoring Doris Kirschner, whose lifelong interest in cooking was culminated in an extraordinary cookbook collection which her family donated to the university libraries in 1995. And I want to share with you a little bit about her collection, and to do that, we have Megan Coker, who is our agriculture librarian, but also the curator of the Kirschner Cookbook Collection. So Megan, want to join us?
Hello, good evening. So I'll give you the very brief introduction to the Kirschner collection. It is housed in the McGraw Library on the St. Paul campus. When we received the Kirschner collection, it was donated by Doris Kirschner in 1995 to the Department of Food Science and Nutrition, which was when she graduated from it, the Department of Home Economics on the St. Paul campus. And at that time, she donated about 1,500 cookbooks, and her family has provided the support both for that collection and for events like these to encourage discussion and scholarship around food and cooking. So now our collection has grown to about 4,000 cookbooks. In this year, some exciting things that happened are that we did some digitization of our materials that are out of copyright. So our older materials can now be found in the U-Media archive, so you can access those online. You don't need to come into the library for those. But that's only a small portion of what you can get if you actually come in, and that is open to the public, as I said. Another thing that we're working on right now is that we've added about 300 ephemeral cookbooks, and those are one of my favorite, probably my very favorite things in the collection are the ephemeral items, which are those little pamphlets and brochures and things like that came with your Jell-O that are in there. It's a really fun collection, really interesting. It gets used for just curious people. It gets used for researchers, by students, and I hope that you will come to visit it. And I'll be around afterwards if you have any more questions about it. I have some books from the collection I brought over so you can get an idea of our range. The books date to about the late 1800s to current. We buy new books every year still for the collection so that it is a growing research collection. All right, thank you.
Well, some of you may wonder how cookbooks become scholarship, but if you think about it, a cookbook from 1950 has information about portions, the kinds of ingredients that were used, often the photographs tell you something about the ambiance and how to set one's table, so it's a wonderful resource for scholarship and for students learning about food over time. So before we get into the main course tonight, I'd like to acknowledge that the Friends Forum is sponsored by the Friends of the Libraries, and for those of you who are friends in the audience, congratulations. We appreciate your commitment. And those who are not friends, your program has information about how to join and how you can support wonderful programs such as the one tonight, and also gives you a forecast of what's upcoming the rest of the year. Now let's talk about food. In the U.S. today, there are more than 38,000 grocery stores, 8,400 farmers markets, 624,000 restaurants, and get this, over 2 million food blogs. And the rise of food trucks is bringing that notion of restaurant and eating experience to our curbs each and every day. Julia Childs started an entire revolution when the French Chef premiered on PBS in 1963, and now we have whole channels devoted to food and cooking and contests. And as the great James Beard once said, food is our common ground, a universal experience. And it's the love of food and love of writing that drew Beth and Jay Ryan together in mutual admiration. Beth is a New Jersey transplant and has been covering the local food scene in the Northern Heartland for over 30 years. She's the author of 6 cookbooks, including Savoring the Seasons of Northern Heartland with Lucia Watson, a James Beard nominee, Minnesota's Bounty, the Farmer's Market Cookbook, the Birchwood Cafe Cookbook with Tracy Singleton and Marshall Paulson, and her most recent book, In Winter's Kitchen, Growing Roots and Breaking Bread in the Northern Heartland. And that's really a collection of stories. It's part memoir and part serious study of foods in this region. I really encourage you to read, both of our authors' books tonight. Beth writes for the Star Tribune and appears regularly on KARE 11 TV as well as the Minnesota Public Radio, and she teaches at the university's Landscape Arboretum. Now, J. Ryan Stradal grew up in Hastings. That would be Hastings, Minnesota. But now he hails from Los Angeles. And as background, J. Ryan was the senior story producer on the television series Deadliest Catch and Ice Road Truckers. And he was a supervising producer on IRT, The Deadliest Roads, Storage Wars, Texas. There's undoubtedly some stories here that we want to ask about later. Yeah. His first novel, Kitchens of the Great Midwest, was published in July of 2015 and quickly rose to number 19 on the New York Times bestseller list in only 3 weeks. It won the American Booksellers Association Indies Choice Book of the Year Award, as well as several other notable honors. So now, let's dig in with a stolen line from Beth's website. Come on into the kitchen, for it's in the kitchen we're never alone. Please join me in welcoming Beth Dooley and J. Ryan Stradal.
All right. First of all, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the Friends of the Library. Thanks to Wendy and Megan and Linnea and everyone else who helped put this together. And I personally also want to thank Beth so much for being here with me every time I'm in Minnesota and I get to see her. It's such a treat. I'll read first a little bit from my debut novel, Kitchens of the Great Midwest. It's the story of a young woman named Eva Torvald who grows up in the upper Midwest and eventually becomes the chef behind a secretive and roving pop-up supper club. But she comes from a rather humble upbringing, living for a time in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And each chapter is based around a different ingredient. And all of those ingredients, except for one, get served in a meal in the final chapter. So I'll read a short excerpt on how Eva's parents met. Lars Torvald loved 2 women. That was it, he thought in passing, while he sat on the cold concrete steps of his apartment building. Perhaps one day he would have loved more than 2, but it just didn't seem like things were going to work out like that. Now that morning, while defying a doctor's orders by pureeing a braised pork shoulder, he looked out the window at the snow on the roof of the Happy Chef restaurant across the highway. Yeah, there's still one of those somewhere, isn't there? Near Albert Lee, maybe? Okay. The snow on the roof of the Happy Chef restaurant across the highway, and sang a love song to one of those 2 girls, his baby daughter, while she slept on the living room rug. He was singing a Beatles song, replacing the name of the girl in the tune with the name of the girl in the room. Now, Lars hadn't told a woman, "I love you," until he was 28. He didn't lose his virginity until he was 28 either. He did have his first kiss when he was 21, but that woman quit returning his calls about a week later. Now, Lars blamed his sorry luck with women on his lack of teenage romance. and he blamed his lack of teenage romance on the fact that he was the worst smelling kid in his grade. Yeah, every year he stank like the floor of a fish market every Christmas. And even when he didn't smell terrible, the other kids acted like he did because that's what kids do. Fish boy, they called him, year-round. And it was all the fault of an old Swedish woman named Dorothy Seaborg. Now, on a December afternoon in 1974, Dorothy Seaborg of Duluth, Minnesota, slipped on the ice and broke her hip while walking to her mailbox, disrupting the supply line of lutefisk for Sunday Advent dinners at St. Olaf's Lutheran Church. Now, Gustav Torvald, Lars' father, was one of the most conspicuous Norwegians between Cloquet and Two Harbors. And I just got to pause to say how grateful I am to be in a room who knows where those places are. So that's actually pretty far, like people have no idea. Thank you. One of the most conspicuous Norwegians between Cloquet and Two Harbors. He promised everyone in St. Olaf's Fellowship Hall that there would be no break in lutefisk continuity. His family would step in and carry on this brutal Scandinavian tradition for the benefit of the entire Twin Ports region. Now, never mind that neither Lars nor his wife Aline nor any of his 3 children had ever even seen a live whitefish before, much less caught one, pounded it, dried it in lye, re-soaked it in cold water, or done the careful cooking required to make something that, when perfectly prepared, looks like jellied smog and smells like boiled aquarium water. Now, since everyone in the house was equally unqualified for the job, the work fell to Lars, age 12, and his younger brother, Jarl, age 10, skipping the youngest boy, Sigmund, age 8, but only because Sigmund actually liked the stuff. If Lars and Jarl don't eat any, their father said, it'll eliminate loss and breakage. And, Gustav was satisfied with that reasoning. Aline still thought it was a mean thing to do to their young sons, but she said nothing. Theirs was a mixed-race marriage between a Norwegian and a Dane. So, therefore, all things culturally important to one but not the other were given a free pass and critiqued only in unmixed company. Now, yearly intimate contact with their cultural heritage failed to evolve the Torvald boys' sensibilities. Jarl, who still ate his own snot, much preferred the taste of boogers to lutefisk, being that the color and consistency are the same. Now, Lars, meanwhile, was stumped by the old Scandinavian women who walked up to him in church and said, any young man who makes lutefisk like you is going to be quite a hit with the ladies. Now, in Lars's experience, lutefisk skills usually inspired revulsion or, at best, indifference among prospective dates. And by the time Lars was 18, he had unintentionally mastered this tragic hobby of lutefisk preparation. And its potency was skyrocketing. Lutherans were driving from as far away as Fergus Falls to eat the Torvald lutefisk. And there wasn't an attractive young woman among any of them. Now, as if to mock him further every year, Lars's dad would shove a forkful of the crap in his face every Christmas. Just a bite, Gustav would say. Your ancestors ate this to survive the long winters. And how did they survive lutefisk? Lars asked once. Take some pride in your work, son, Gustav said, and took away Lars's lefse in punishment. Now, in 1978, Lars graduated from high school and got the heck out of Duluth. So he moved down to the cities, looking for a girlfriend and kitchen work in whatever order, only insisting that neither one ask him to make lutefisk. That attitude left a lot more options open than his dad predicted. Now, by October 1987, as his home state was enraptured by the Twins winning their first World Series ever, Lars had earned a job as a chef at Hopmakers, a trendy lakeside bistro that attracted big celebrities like meteorologists and state senators and local pro athletes. Amid the circumstance of this long-suffering sports team's success, the strange joy of it all spread through the restaurant. It was during these happy weeks when Cynthia Hargreaves, the smartest waitress on staff, she gave the best wine pairing advice of any of the servers. She seemed to take an interest in Lars. Lars, by this point, was already 28, already growing a pale, hairy inner tube around his waist, and already going bald. Now, Cynthia, even though she had an overbite and the shakes, she was 6 feet tall and beautiful, and not like a statue or a perfume advertisement, but in a realistic way, like how a truck or a pizza is beautiful at the moment you want it most. And this, to Lars, made her feel approachable. All right, thank you. Now a little from you, Beth, please. Yeah. That's awesome. Are you on?
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great.
Awesome.
Thank you. Before I start, I just want to give a shout out to the Kirschner Library, and thank you so much for that reading. I mean, this book is so much fun to read. I found myself reading it to other people when we were sitting on the porch. In fact, one of my friends, before I met Jay Ryan, was reading it on our porch on Madeline Island and laughing hysterically. Of course, I grabbed it from her. So wonderful characters. But I wanted to give a shout out to the Kirschner Library because in reference to whether or not cookbooks are scholarship, I learned in anthropology that it's not the great works that make a culture often. It's the little things like what people eat and how they serve them. And I think I've learned so much about the world and culture, different parts of the universe through cookbooks. And I also have to give a shout out to this book, which is now out of print. But it's a cookbook that Lillian Hellman, of all people, wrote with Peter Feldeman. And it's a wonderful part memoir, part recipes. And what's so much fun about reading a cookbook is you get such insight into other people's lives. And what's fun about this book is that Peter tells the story of how Lillian would go about getting ready for a dinner party. And of course, she had a wonderful home on Shelter Island, and she would have all the New York literati come, and she'd send out an engraved invitation to Norman Mailer and to Dashiell Hammett and all these other people. And they would all get, chitter-chat about what Lillian was going to serve. And she would wake up every morning, Peter reports, because he was helping her out at that time. And she would wake up every morning a month before the party, and she would write out a menu. And the next morning, she'd write out a different menu. And the day of the party, she would go down to the farmer's market. She'd shop like crazy without the menu. She'd come home, clean the house like a banshee, cook like a fiend, and then put her feet up with a martini and a cigarette and say, who the hell invited all these goddamn people anyway? So that's in the book. So, you'll find out a lot about people's lives in cookbooks. So I'll read just a little bit. Cookbooks, when I moved here, I didn't know anybody. I'd always loved reading cookbooks, and it was between the farmers markets and the cookbooks that really helped me find my way home. I was unpacking boxes in our apartment, and my mother, I came across a copy of my mother's Joy of Cooking that she had slipped into one of the boxes as a surprise. And it was a book that I'd used all through high school. It greeted me like an old friend. As a teenager, I tucked it into my book bag to read like a novel when I should have been studying. All through college, when I'd felt lost or homesick, I turned to cookbooks to soothe and to entertain. And cookbooks, too, had introduced me to agriculture's environmental issues back when I had been a graduate student living in a shared house, cooking with friends. Diet for a Small Planet, the Moosewood Cookbook, had been our Bibles of food awakening. Fueled by nicotine and cheap wine, we'd linger for hours at our table, an old door propped on cinder block legs, discussing farm issues and claiming the personal is political, and talking over Cesar Chavez's and workers' rights and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and the dangers of alar and DDT. So as I sat at the table my brother had built for our first Minneapolis kitchen, turning those sticky, dog-eared pages, I began to feel more at home. For beneath a cookbook's list of ingredients and steps to follow lie tales as rich and as deep as any to be found in fiction. They are forays into families' homes and glimpses into far-off lands, redolent of garlic and rosemary, saffron and cardamom. Recipes are stories with happy endings, of being sated and cared for in a way that feels gentle. I'd even suggest that the intentions of a cookbook author are the same as those of a novelist, to use both creativity and format to transmit an experience to the reader. I'd revisited the old joy. I realized I wanted to learn this language and to translate the sounds and scents and tastes of cooking onto the page, just as a composer writes out a score. I've always been happiest in the kitchen, chopping and sizzling and stirring and creating food that nourishes and delights. And so as a reader of cookbooks, I love the instructions that help me imagine a meal. I wanted to know how to document such steps to pleasure, how both to capture and to share them. And I hope such work would guide my search for the hearth and the heart of the home. Despite all my readings, however, I'd never really stepped onto a farmer's field. And so when I went to the Minneapolis market, I could finally get the answers directly from the growers about what it takes to cultivate delicious bright green lettuce and why local varieties I used in my salad cost more than the pale heads sold in grocery stores. And I began to understand local food. And as anybody who has experienced the farmers markets and then gone off to source food directly from a farm or to go pick apples, it really connects you to the land in a very specific and personal way. So I'll also just read a short part from the first chapter, Apples. Each of us has at least one fairy tree in our life, whether or not we remember. Mine was the apple tree in my childhood backyard. Its U-shaped trunk was a wild place for me to hide with Daisy, our gangly yellow lab. And when the blossoms burst open, we'd lounge in their fragrance, waiting for spirits to dust the flowers into ruby fruit. Later, I'd climb the branches to fill a pillowcase, and Daisy licked the apple sticky juice from my hands. Such a tree greeted me some 35 years later at the Western Wisconsin farm campus of the Land School, our son's Minneapolis Montessori school. Predating World War I, this tree reveals the place's history with a simplicity that would elude even the most gifted storyteller. The sturdy, gnarled survivor was the first thing I saw when I came up the hard-backed dirt drive. Its low branches were open and welcoming like a ready embrace. It blossoms splendidly and produces lady apples with yellowish skins and pretty red cheeks and a faint scent of strawberries and of rose. It's the variety of tree that grows especially well in this region, needing the long, cold winter to go dormant, and enough snow to both protect it from the overly harsh temperatures and when the weather warms to melt and provide the tree with moisture. At harvest time, our young sons would joyfully wriggle up into the branches for this distinctly sweet, tart, ping-pong ball-sized fruit, and then they'd drop with a soft thud and chase each other across the fields. Picking apples is a quiet and absorbing task. You're centered on a thin limb, stretching on tiptoe into the leaves, seeking balance. It seems the most prized apples are always the hardest to grasp. Cradled amidst the scent of ripe and rotting apples, you gain perspective on the earth's daily spin from a sweet, safe perch. A good apple tastes of September's sun, the warm, waning light, of its lineage, of the weather, the soil, and the way it was tended. All this is to say that a good apple is the taste of balance, a range of natural acids and sugars with notes so complex and different they come on in waves of flavor with each bite. When cooked, a good apple may lose some of its subtlety, that hint of raspberries or rose or pepper or sage, while the essential character, the sharp and the sweet, becomes more intense. The variety of fruit and how and where it was grown informs the apple, just as the experience of the eater have everything to do with how its taste is received. So I doubt that I'd love apples so very much if I never climbed into those trees as a child. And then, when your favorite tree gives you too many apples, you make applesauce, right? Or apple pies or things like that. And picking apples is mesmerizing, and getting our sons to come down from the tree to head home was a challenge. The truckload of fruit filled the car with a sense of sweet grass and of decay. Back in our kitchen, our oldest son, the most cautious one, sliced the apples, and then the youngest one, who took this work very seriously, cut them into smaller pieces, and then the least patient one, the middle son, of course, would pitch them into a pot from far away. On the stove, the sauce burbled its cinnamon comfort, and they'd take turns stirring the sauce, jumping up and down. One indigo evening, just as we returned from the orchard, my father called to say he'd landed in town and hoped it wouldn't be an imposition to spend the night. Because he was an amateur pilot, it wasn't odd for him to fly cross-country, earning air miles, but he never arrived unannounced. That night, he entered the kitchen subdued and wearied. What had motivated this trip, and why was he so downtrodden? A spat with my mother, a business setback, but I was distracted by homework and 3 little kids and dinner and baths and applesauce, so I never really asked. But what I recall now is how, as he sat at the table, he relaxed in the glow of a glass of scotch and seemingly was soothed by the boys who scrambled up on his lap and hopped down to stir the sauce. The kitchen filled with good smells while he shared stories of his war years on an escort ship in the Pacific and then of bumming around through Alsace, which also happened to be our ancestral home. The other day, our now 25-year-old son invited me over for dinner, and as I tripped over the bushel of apples in his doorway, it wasn't hard for me to discern that he needed my help making applesauce and apple butter. And as we peeled and sliced, I realized that apples embody the endless qualities of motherhood, of risk and comfort and promise. Cooking in my son's kitchen, I was knocked back into the presence of my father and of our boys in the trees and into the moments of reckless joy, balancing on branches myself. Some say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but as our sons mature, I watch myself becoming the child of my children, just as my father sought parental comfort from me. I witnessed my son's journey into adulthood. I vicariously experienced their delights and disappointments, a privilege and a curse. I seemed to grow older and younger at once, as the child I was, the mother I used to be, and the grandmother I hoped to become collapsed together. So, thanks.
So Beth, it's hard to believe, but that book came out about a year ago.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you talk a little bit about how things have changed since your book come out? And yeah, I'd love to hear about.
Yeah, you're nice to ask, and
Yeah.
you do some of this in your book as well. You talk about.
It would be nice to do that. From now on, I'm going to cough into my left hand and cover it with my right hand.
It's the lutefisk, right?
Yeah.
But Wendy alluded to how food has really exploded in our consciousness, and what I find sort of encouraging is how interested people have become in local food, and not as much as in what's hot and what the trends are in local food, but also in how food is grown, where it's coming from, and why we should care. And I think I really, and I don't want to get too preachy about this, but I really do think that food has become the most important issue of our time. Because it touches everything. It touches how we relate to each other. It touches nutrition. It touches social equity. It certainly, is all the concerns around our environment have to do with how food is grown and how it comes to us. And so I think, everyone comes into all of these issues in a different way. Some people come into it because they want really good food and they know that by going to the farmer's market or joining a CSA, they're going to get the most flavorful food. Other people come to it because their doctors told them that they need to cut back on fats and salts and sugars and processed foods, and so they begin using more fresh food. Other people come into it because they're concerned about the environment. So I think, for all of these reasons, people are paying more and more attention to local food. And I mean, you must see that all the time as well when you come back, because you come back and forth, and things have changed so much. Your book sort of covers that too.
Yeah, in creating my character Eva Torvald, I really wanted to create a character that was born in the Minnesota I was born into. I was born in 1975, and the food environment was very different then than it is now. Even a lot of the restaurants, I was just talking to an audience member, Phoebe, about this. So many of the restaurants I mentioned in my book that were the fancy restaurants of the early 80s are all gone. There's like this city doesn't even have really like those same kinds of institutions as much. But I think that has a lot to do with how our relationship with food has evolved. And I wanted Eva to typify that, being born in the 80s and, growing up in places like River Falls, Wisconsin and Des Moines, Iowa, where she had access to a variety of food, but maybe wasn't exposed to it by the people that raised her. And then becomes a chef behind a pop-up supper club. I couldn't think of anything more modern than that at the time I wrote it. I thought, and plus I thought, I want to create this roving pop-up supper club that is never in a fixed location, and it's going to charge $1,000 per course. I thought, this is ludicrous, but in retrospect, it seems like historical fiction. I mean, I don't think there are people charging quite that much yet. Or if there are, I haven't heard of it. There are people come close, certainly. I've heard of 4 figures for meals, and I've heard of roving pop-up supper clubs as well. But I didn't know those things existed when I wrote the book. In fact, when I wrote the book, when Eva's 11, she's hydroponically growing hot peppers in her closet in Iowa. Yeah, I mean, my dad, who's here in the audience today, can occasionally grow like serranos and jalapenos in St. Cloud. But I think if you want to grow like a really hot pepper like she's growing, I think you got to do it indoors, above a certain USDA hardiness zone. And I thought, there's got to be kids like this, right? Like in the world, there's got to be these young foodies that are just nuts about this. This is before any TV shows devoted to this existed. I just surmised that I was a weird little kid myself, absolutely bedeviled by strange obsessions and driven passionately into all of them, that I thought, well, boy, there's got to be someone who was, is, or could be as into food as I was into the things I was into when I was a child. And the character and her passions and evolved from that, and that became, of course, a kind of a what's a good analogy, like a net for ways in which food has influenced people and have evolved in this region.
And what I love about Eva, though, is that she has this wonderful big heart and this terrific welcoming personality that, to me, sort of embodies Midwestern hospitality. And I can say this, having grown up on the East Coast, that there is something really special about this region. And I think it has to do with the fact that we really still live in an agricultural culture. We are so incredibly impacted by the weather. Even if you go from your heated garage to your heated parking ramp to your heated office and never step a foot outside, walk through the skyways for lunch or whatever, you still don't want to have a salad in the middle of February. You want a big bowl of soup or something really warm to eat. It really affects our appetites. And I also think if you scratch a Minnesotan, you'll find a farmer underneath, usually a couple, 1 or 2 generations back. And because of the impact of the weather and because of this sort of agricultural tradition, we help each other out in ways that I don't think you see in the rest of the country. And that may also have to do with, and you reference this too in your book, the people that settled here first were Scandinavians. And they're the ones that started the credit unions. I think that's why our co-op movement has been so strong. And a lot of the farmers back early on against the use of chemicals. A lot of the farmers down in the driftless area, which is where the glaciers weren't able to flatten out the land, they never got into monoculture. They continued to farm using sustainable practices, which eventually became called organic. And they were the first farms to supply the People's Pantry, which became one of the first co-ops in the country. And so, we have this tradition, we have this very collaborative culture, I think, anyway. And in a really nice way, Eva kind of embodies that in her, constantly wanting to gather people and feed people and just sort of push food forward as well. And I think, it's interesting, too, because a lot of things that are going on here in our region are informing the rest of the country in terms of food, both in terms of the research that's being done at the University of Minnesota, for instance, by Don Weiss and some of the other soil researchers and scientists on perennial wheats and on heritage grains and things like that are all coming out of Minnesota. So it's cool. Yeah. So yeah, and so who did you have? You must have had somebody in mind when you came up with Eva, right?
Oh wow, I had a few people.
Yeah.
One of whom is a Minnesotan chef. Her name's Amy Shabert Kovacs, and she worked. She's worked at a number of restaurants and bakeries around Minneapolis. She works at the Lowbrow right now, but I met her in high school before she was a chef at all. Before she got a degree in nutrition? Yeah, and so I saw her evolution as a person and as a chef. I've seen it for, I'll say I've seen it for 35 years. I don't want to age her, or 25 years. 25 years. That said, she was a big influence because every time I'd come back, I usually stay with her at least one night, stay with her and her husband, and I see her cooking, at night and in the morning, and I've seen how the ingredients she used has evolved, and also as a baker, how her job has evolved. When she got her degree, 15 years ago, she wasn't asked to make gluten-free desserts, She wasn't expected to make vegan birthday cake. And these are some of the contortions that she's had to be agile enough to evolve with. Yet at the same time, she still really loves making, what we would consider to be, traditional Midwestern food and desserts. And it's so much fun to hang out in her kitchen and talk with her about what's going on? Like, how are things changing? How are things changing for you? What are people buying?
Yeah.
What are they not buying anymore?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, too, to take that a step further. We're seeing all of these food entrepreneurs, and they're being supported by a number of incubator kitchens. They're commercial kitchens that people can lease space out in. And it's been great for the local food movement because the entrepreneurs are buying local products. They're buying carrots or tomatoes or whatever it happens to be. They're making pickled carrots, or they're making tomato sauce, or there's the food building down on Marshall and 13th where the baker who used to be with Rustica is now milling and baking bread from heritage flour, and it's beautiful bread. It's all sourdough bread. And then there's a creamery there that's making cheeses, single source cheese, and it's called Lone Grazer, and it's all organic, it's beautiful cheeses. And he came from the Faribault, from the Faribault caves, and it was the cheesemaker there.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, and the cheese is gorgeous. And then there's Red Table Meats, which has won all kinds of awards for using the old Italian style to cure pork sausages and salamis and things like that. And so we're seeing a lot of these traditional artisan foodways coming back, but they're doing it at scale so that they're supporting the farmers. The guy who's making Red Table Meats is now keeping 2 hog farms going, and these farms were in danger of going under. So, it's there's this whole kind of, there's an interest on the consumer part, and then the market's responding to it in a pretty interesting, fun way. And so it's, we've both seen those changes since we've been here. It's a far cry from I don't. You're probably not old enough to remember Becky's Cafeteria. Did you ever have to go there?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't remember Becky.
It's your dad. I bet your dad remembers Becky's Cafeteria.
Oh, yeah.
It was great. I mean, you
Yeah.
walked in and there were velvet curtains and there was kind of organ music playing. And at the host stand, when you walked in, the Bible was open to like Jeremiah, 451 or something. It was
Wow.
a Jello salad and fried chicken and mashed potatoes and things. So yeah, we've come a long way since then.
Yeah. One of the things I'm writing about my next book is beer.
Cool.
So it's been a lot of fun to research that. Whenever I come back here, I try to try something new, and it's really hard to keep up.
Yeah.
I had to look up these numbers. In 2011, at the end of 2011, there were 35 craft breweries in Minnesota. Now there are 105.
Yeah.
And in 1978, nationally, there were 89 breweries nationally in 1978. Now there are 4,269. I talked to someone in Washington State who is a supplier to breweries. And he said, if you want to start a business that's not going to go out of business, start a brewery. He said they have a very low failure rate. Some do fail, but he said that's a remarkably difficult job to screw up. Because he said, people want beer. It's typically not very expensive. And he also seemed to discern. He said, the closest brewery to me, 5 miles away, is terrible. And people still buy it. It's like it's one product that you don't have to be that good at to have people drink it. Now, that's obviously going to shake out. I mean, over time, I don't know if the brewery he's discussing is going to survive 30 years. They could if they get better, perhaps. But what he was saying is that there's room for everybody in this industry, and it's fun to see. Even in my hometown, they're starting a brewery in Hastings. I think in the old Hudson Sprayer building, right by where Highway 61 enters Hastings. And I was just thinking that last year. I was literally there last summer, and I was looking at that old warehouse and going, if this were Brooklyn, there'd be a brewery in there. And yeah, what do you know? So I think it's just great. I think that's a really, really cool thing to see evolve as part of the evolution in food. Also because in a state like this, there's, now with the hops farms starting to evolve in the state as well, there's, we're going to start seeing more and more Minnesota beer that's completely grain to bottle, 100% Minnesotan. Because certainly they're able to do that in a lot of other places. I mean, certainly we have some distilleries in the state that already do that are really wonderful. But it'll be really great as the hops farms get their legs under them that they'll be supplying more breweries and we'll have more 100% Minnesota beer.
Yeah, it's cool. It's fabulous. And on top of that, cider is kind of the next beer.
Yeah.
So and the wonderful thing about all of these hard cider places that are opening is that it's creating more diversity in our apple orchards because cider apples are different than the sweet apples we're used to eating out of hand. In fact, they're called spitters because you take a bite and they're loaded with tannins, but that's what makes the cider interesting.
Right.
And so
right.
you get a balance between the sweet and the tannic flavors, and that's what makes a good cider. And cider actually was what people drank instead of water when they first moved here because water could be dangerous.
That's right.
And so and they would use the milk to make cheese, and milk because milk's spoiled so quickly, so they'd use the milk to make butter and cheese, and they would give cider to their kids as well because it was the cleanest thing they could drink. So we're seeing a lot of cideries come back, and it's been great for the apple industry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
What else have you seen evolve in the last 5 years or in the last year or two?
Yeah, well, there's been an explosion in the farmers markets, and there's also been an explosion in different different ways of marketing food. So we're seeing a lot more CSAs, winter CSAs, where people might subscribe to both the summer. Everybody's familiar with CSAs, right? Community supported agriculture, where you pay in advance for a season's worth of fruits and vegetables from a particular farm. A lot of the farmers are now offering year-long CSAs, and they're also offering meat CSAs or cheese CSAs, so you can get whatever product you want by paying for it in advance. And it's been great for the farmers because they then get a year's worth of, or they get their money up front rather than having to take the risk. And what I love about CSAs is as a cook, I have to respond to whatever I get in the box.
Right,
So,
right.
rather than marching into the store, into the farmer's market with my list, I have to respond to whatever's there. And so if it's all kohlrabi, you got to deal with all kohlrabi, right?
That's right.
You have to learn to be creative.
Yeah, versatile.
So, yeah,
Excellent.
yeah. Like when you come back to Minnesota, what do you seek out? What do you miss? Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot of, well, one of the things that I'm going to get to have on this trip that I don't always get to have is venison.
Nice.
Yeah, my dad was successful this season. Yeah, and so it was really great to come back to a state, grew up in a hunting family. In fact, I'm the only male on my dad's side of the family that's never hunted. And there's quite a few. My dad is one of 9 siblings, so do the math. And that said, I just never got around to it. I was never opposed to it. But I always like to use that first weekend in November to hang out at home and read. I was that kid. I still am. That said, I love venison, and I had absolutely no problem with my dad hanging the bleeding deer in the garage. And so, yeah, it's fun to come back this time of year because that's one of the things that I consider to be, even though venison, obviously, you can have any time of year, and as I kind of point out in my book, it's one of those foods that's not necessarily better fresh, But that said, I do associate it with fall, and I associate it with this time of year, and it's fun to come back and have something like that was also part of our family tradition and part of the family, and put on my table specifically, woods to fork from a family member.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think all of that game is coming back. And so in our meat markets even, we're seeing, not wild, but farm-raised pheasant and rabbit. We're seeing a lot more rabbit now, and venison and elk. And I'm actually working on a cookbook right now with a guy that goes by the name the Sioux Chef, S-I-O-U-X.
Oh, yeah.
Chef, yeah. And it's really interesting. It's pre-colonial Native American food.
Wow.
So he's peeled back, all of the European influence on his culture and taken a hard look at what people ate before the Europeans arrived. And so I think what will be really interesting for people as they begin to explore some of his recipes is how much food is available to us right outside our back door in really interesting ways. So he will simmer wild rice with a branch of cedar, for instance, and it gives it a wonderful flavor.
Wow.
And he'll use juniper to season, an elk steak or something, or a venison steak. So it's again, I think what we're seeing are people begin to explore all of these other cultures, and just kind of bring them into a contemporary kitchen in fascinating ways. I've learned a lot about that culture just by working with them. Yeah.
That said, have you also seen a boom in foraging and more outlets for foragers?
Yeah. And it's wonderful. And Teresa Marone, who's a local food writer, has a couple of books out about foraging, about how to find wild sorrel along the edge of a highway, or where the best watercress is, and along with morels, of course, and the different mushrooms. There are wild berries all over the place. There are elderberries in, I know right where they are along Cedar Lake. So things like that, yeah. And it's fun. I mean, more and more people are getting into that.
Oh.
Yeah.
And right now, what would you consider to be like a can't miss market or a restaurant or cafe?
Oh wow, that's a great question. Like you said about breweries, it's changing all the time. There's the Hmong Market over in the corner of St. Paul that has really interesting things, and most of the people speak English. There's the Indian Spice Market, which has some wonderful spices.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's just called the Indian Spice Market. And then, it's the farm to table thing, and the nose to tail cooking has sort of forced a lot of chefs to return to some of the heritage way of preparing foods. For instance, if you go to Bachelor Farmer, Chef Paul uses as a base for a lot of his sauces and for some of his soups what they call old water, But it's really, I know it sounds weird, doesn't it? But it's really just a method of continuing to simmer down bones and in the basic stock, like chefs always have. But he puts everything in there. He puts smoked ham bones in there. He puts wild game bones in there. And what you end up with is this really rich but very clear broth that he then uses as a base for a lot of his different sauces and soups. And it's fabulous. But what has to happen is that it is simmered for such a long time. We're seeing an explosion in as people get more interested in, for instance, Somali cooking. We're beginning to see some of the Somali restaurants open up and different, chefs beginning to adapt some of those things. There's a lot of crossover, and so it's exciting. I mean, you can't swing a cat almost without hitting another coffee shop or brewery or somebody doing something interesting. We're seeing a lot of fermented foods. There's a wonderful little place called Gist, G-Y-S-T, which is kimchis and sauerkrauts and pickled things, and then really interesting cheeses and different wines and stuff. And they have both a tasting bar and a little sort of cafe area, as well as selling a lot of their kombucha and things like that. So dried foods, jerkies and pemmican and things like that are coming back. So,
that's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really interesting. So, and a lot of people are working hard to do more things off the grid. So, in terms of both being careful about not having a lot of waste, about using the entire animal, cooking things down to make broths and things like that, drying things to preserve them, and then fermenting things are all old ways of preserving food, but they put to use what you might not use in a meal. So, yeah.
There's a organization in Los Angeles called Food Forward that takes unsold food from farmers markets and sometimes from agriculture directly, and uses it to make food that they donate to homeless shelters and so on. Is there an organization like that here as well? Or?
There is. We've got Second Harvest is one, and then so a lot of the food shelves will accept seconds and things like that. What's been great is the Minneapolis Public Schools, and I think the St. Paul's Public Schools are starting to do this now, is they're contracting with farmers to buy their seconds. So it's the imperfect tomatoes and the apples and things, and some of the farmers markets are doing that as well. But they'll also turn that food into, there's the Minneapolis Public Schools has done a phenomenal job of cooking from scratch. They have a big commissary where they prepare a lot of the food and ship it out to the schools, but it's prepared fresh. And then they also are putting kitchens into a number of their schools. So scratch cooking is coming back in the schools as well. It's been great. Yeah. So there's a lot of that stuff going on too. It's again, we're pretty progressive when it comes to that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, do you think we should open it to questions from the audience?
I think we better. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yes, sir.
There was an interesting article in the paper, I think it was today, where a large food company in the Twin Cities that has a director of sustainability decided to partner. A large food company decided to partner with other nonprofits in the area of pollinization, probably in the upper Midwest. So the idea of sustainability, could you talk a little bit about that? That's going to involve where water comes from, climate change, population movement, probably areas of strife where people don't have a lot of food. And so sustainability is my question. And also, could you talk about small providers of food and large providers of food and how they can interact together?
Yeah, those are really broad questions, and they're great questions, and they really address, the whole issue of food. Actually, I have a couple of answers, if you can bear with me. Both the Food Council for the City of Minneapolis and it's called the Food and Nutrition Council in St. Paul, are working with both the park system as well as with on city land to make sure that they're pollinator friendly, so that they're requiring that they use plants that don't have any neonicotinoids in them, and they're trying to encourage homeowners to do the same thing. And so what we're going to see in the next couple of years is soccer fields that may have clover on them instead of, you know, beautiful grasses and things. And I think that's great. It's so interesting because our legislature almost passed a law forbidding farms to use neonicotinoids in very pollinator-sensitive areas, and then that was reversed. So that, you know, we're going to keep pushing to make that happen again. It's gotten very difficult for a lot of the cranberry farmers to get enough bees to pollinate their cranberry plants. They have to bring them in. And pollinator collapse disorder has been a big problem because of the neonicotinoids. So they're working on how to reverse that. There's a lot of work being done by the Bee Institute, which is Marla Spivak at the University of Minnesota, and that's a great website. And they have a lot of information about things that we can do to help support that work, both at the university and at the legislature and in our cities. So that's one answer to the bee thing. You know, in terms of the small farms and the large farms and how they're working together, I don't know if you saw this article in today's Strib about Jack Hedin. He is the farmer at Featherstone Farm, which is a phenomenal, an amazing organic farm. It did until this year supply practically all the organic carrots to our co-ops and to Whole Foods, as well as to the Whole Foods in Chicago. And he suffered one of the worst seasons he's ever had. He lost $450,000 worth of crop. And it's going to be really hard for him to come back from that. He did a big You Fund Me campaign. I think it might still be open if people want to go on his website. But it was really devastating. And I think, you know, again, I don't want to get it too far into politics, but I'm hoping one of the things that happens with this awareness around local food is that we begin to call our politicians to become more responsive to these issues. You know, it wasn't too long ago, it was back in the late 50s, as far as the 50s or even mid-60s, when every presidential candidate addressed farm issues. You know, that was a big lobby, and we're not seeing that so much anymore, mostly because we have two kinds of farms now. We have the corporate farms, and then they have a very huge lobbying presence, and then we have the smaller organic farms, which don't have the money to lobby. And so I really think it's important for us to understand what these issues are and to ask about whether or not we're going to enforce things like border strips on farms that help prevent runoff into the Mississippi, and whether we're going to call into question the use of neonicotinoids that damage our pollinators, things like that. Glyphosate, which is the chemical in Roundup. I mean, these are questions that we can ask our politicians because certainly we have the leverage to begin to ask them that, and also to support the people that are using best practices. What's interesting to me as well is that back in the 1970s, before corporate agriculture became as big a presence as it is now, there was parity between the large organic farms and the farms that use chemicals. And what happened really was that Earl Butz, who was pressured by the chemical companies and some of the large seed companies, began to say things like, when you hear the word organic, think starvation. And he then and the USDA did a white paper study into whether or not organic practices were as effective as our using chemicals. And they found that, yes, in many cases they were. They studied 20,000 farms, and they did a white paper on it that was released to the extension agents that used it. When that paper went out of print, Butz had the word organic struck from all the USDA materials until the early 70s. when there was sort of, some of the organic farmers began to become aware of that and require that that be reinstated. So, I don't want to get too dark, but I do think that, if we care about food, we need to care about these kinds of issues. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, thanks. More questions?
I saw in the Trib that General Mills was buying or contracting with Organic Valley for milk products. Do you have some concerns about those types of partnerships?
I think General Mills is making some smart moves. They just started an initiative with the Nature Conservancy around soil health, because they're recognizing that soil health is going to be one of the big issues in the future. And so with the Nature Conservancy, they're beginning to come up with some guidelines that they'd like the farmers that they contract with to follow. And that, frankly, is in response to the pressure that consumers are putting General Mills under. So we have a lot of power. We have the power of the purse. In terms of Organic Valley, that is a farmer-run board. So I trust that the farmers are pretty wary of the kinds of contracts they get into. And the reason why I'm saying that is because they refuse to contract with Kmart and with Walmart and another big box store. In fact, I think Target might have been one of them, because they understood that they could get into a contract with those companies, but then all of their product would be, taken up going to these big box stores, and the smaller retailers and the co-ops wouldn't have access to their organic milk. So I think, because I've applauded what Organic Valley has done in the past, and because that farmer board has a history of being really responsible to their members and to their retailers, that they're probably doing it with caution. Organic Valley was formed after that first farm crisis, because those farmers were in such bad shape. They thought, we've got to do something and work together, or we're all going to go under. And so they have a history of best practices. Yeah.
In order to become organically certified, you have to let your field go fallow for 3 years. So one of the things that this cooperative is getting supported by General Mills for the 3 years that they can't make any money as an organic farm. So, okay, it's big ag, true, but they're all, like you said, they're taking a supportive role.
Right. Yeah, and it's that's another thing to be aware of, is that when those farms are transitioning into organic, in Europe, for instance, there are tax breaks for conventional farms that are going to transition to organic, so that they can wait that period out without suffering too much. Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
I'm not going to put you on the spot anymore, Beth. I'm going to shift it to Jay Ryan.
Excellent. Good.
So I'm going to bring you back to your chat about beer earlier.
Yeah.
You were saying how there's plenty of breweries. It's a safe industry to enter into, no matter what level of experience you have in brewing.
That's what one brewery supplier told me anyway.
Yeah, and that's plenty of our
course,
perceptions as well.
And of course, it's his incentive to believe that. Yeah.
So it's interesting to me when there's a food business like beer, I consider that in the food industry, that has a model that's set up to succeed no matter what the level of experience or skill is inherent in that brewer, but yet we have farmers with the opposite kind of experience. So you have very skilled, experienced farmers who are finding themselves in the system that is set up to fail them. So could you talk a little bit about what you have been finding in your research about the culture around beer that has made that so successful, and any parallels you might see between beer and the farming world, or I guess the opposite of parallels?
Well, one of the things interesting about beer is that a lot of states, counties, cities have blue laws that restrict the amount of beer someone can, distribute, and so some of the restrictions put on small breweries, I think have actually, in some parts of the country, have actually helped them in a sense, like kind of get better before they get big. There's also a huge home brewing community. It doesn't take a lot of money to start, and it doesn't take a lot of time. Like, this isn't like wine growing. I have some friends who are attempting to bottle wine. I think it's taken them 5 years before they were able to bottle a wine that they would consider sellable, and even then, they feel like this isn't that good. Like, it's still going to take some time for it to be better. It's just because of the nature of beer making. It doesn't get better with age. Most of the vast majority. There are whole varieties of beer that are very trendy now that are extremely local, like sour beers. It's just a particular type of expression of food and beverage that, to me, is very, very conducive to beginners because of a relatively low entrance bar economically, like relatively low turnaround time, and people being vastly interested in it. One of the things that underscores the fact that there were only 89 breweries in 1978 is that an awful lot of them weren't very good then either, or they were very similar to each other. It's really like, I'm not that old. I guess I'm not that old. I'm old enough. I'm old enough to remember that when I became old enough to buy beer, there sure wasn't the variety there was now. And it sure felt like, oh, you're just buying different versions of the same thing. And that really isn't true anymore. It's evolved in a way that just feels phenomenally dilated to me. And I think it'll continue to, it's a community that likes to challenge each other and challenge itself internally. One of the things that they've also done, I think, to embolden it from within and give it a sense of nobility is that they've reconstituted, maybe that's not quite the right verb, they've reconstituted, I'll just go with it. They reconstituted the noun cicerone, which was not a term originally used to describe beer sommeliers, but one that is now universally described thusly. So that said, there are now places where you can go to study beer. There's evolving a hierarchical structure of beer knowledge in some areas. But there's also, I see this all through different types of agricultural communities. It's tremendously, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is tremendously internally supportive. That there really is a community. Like, these brewers know each other, they support each other. You go to one brewery, they'll say, like, hey, you like this beer, go 30 miles up the road, there's this other brewery, you'll love them too. And I think that helps too. In any case, I hope that answers your question. I feel like rambling a bit here, but I hope that helps. That's what I see when I look at why this community is so successful so quickly. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Wait.
I was kind of surprised to hear that it's cheap to start brewing beer.
Well, it can be.
When
relatively.
You walk into these brew pubs with these huge rooms full of big tanks,
Sure.
That can't be that cheap.
Well, no, that kind of material isn't.
Yeah.
But I mean, to just be able to start making drinkable beer. I'm talking about, like, you could do it for a few $100s. It's like you could make beer that people would buy, and there aren't a lot of industries, where food goes through some kind of process, of which that is true. Maybe, I suppose distilled beverages, sure, as well. Vodka, perhaps in particular. But with beer, it's like, no. Obviously, we're talking small production here, but you can get competent at it and be able to sell your work at a relatively low overhead. Relatively, I'm saying, yeah. But yeah, thanks. I appreciate the addendum to that because, it's certainly not free. Hops don't grow in your backyard, unless you really want them there.
On the beer thing, I heard that we had hundreds of breweries in Minnesota in the
Yeah.
19th century. That,
Oh, in the 19th century?
well, I don't know when
Oh, it's
it was.
quite
A long
possible.
time ago, anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's not my question. I want to change the subject totally. Um, I'm not really a cookbook reader, but I have a big collection of cookbooks. But what I am interested in is sort of the memoirs, cooking memoirs, the ones of Julia Childs and some of what's her name,
M.F.K. Fisher.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
MFK
But
Fisher
I
is
was wondering,
amazing.
do you have any recommendations
Yes, I
of
think
cookbook memoirs?
Yeah, I think my favorites are by Laurie Colwin, Colwin. She was a short story writer, and she had a number of her stories published in the New Yorker, but she also was a columnist for Gourmet magazine. Wonderful, wonderful writer. Laurie Colwin. She has two collections out. One is called Home Cooking, and the other one is called More Home Cooking. And then it's more recipe. It's not quite as much memoir, but they're beautifully written. There are two books by Nigel Slater. He's a British author. One is called Ripe, and the other is called Tender. And the photos are absolutely gorgeous, but the way he writes is really compelling. And in both of those books, each chapter deals with a particular item. So it's, apples and berries and stuff like that. But he's also an incredible gardener. So he writes about gardening and cooking, but there's a lot of memory and history woven into the introductions to his recipes for each of the items that he's writing about. And they're beautifully written. So yeah, those are my four favorite. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have some? How about you?
Oh, wow. I love MFK Fisher. I'm really glad
Yeah.
you brought her up.
Yeah.
Yeah, she might be my favorite. In a way, she's sort of the original food writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I read a lot of fiction that has food elements in it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's an author named Amelia Gray who I'm going to feature in February. I'm starting a job as the fiction editor at a new food magazine called Taste. So I'm going to be publishing all food-related fiction. So if any of you are fiction writers and like to write about food, please send me something. So yeah, Amelia Gray is someone that comes to mind. I mean, she hasn't really written a book explicitly about food, but I love the way she writes about food when she does. There's a writer named Rachel Kong. She used to be the managing editor at Lucky Peach. She is having a book come out called Goodbye Vitamin. I think she's an excellent food writer and a fiction writer. So those are the first two that come to mind, are Rachel and Amelia. They're the first two people I reached out to when I was given this job. Like, find fiction writers who write well about food. And I thought, Amelia and Rachel, right away. Then there's a few other people who I'd love to get a hold of, but they're probably hard to find, or they'd say no. But there's some really wonderful, Asian writers like the author of The Vegetarian, and I thought Pao by Mo Yan was really cool. It's really disgusting, but it's a cool book about food. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind. But yeah, I mean, look for Taste Magazine in February, and I'm going to do my best to populate it with the best food-related fiction I can find.
This is a question for Jay Ryan.
Yes, hi.
Beth talked a little bit about food trends in the Twin Cities. If you were to tell us about food trends in Los Angeles, what might you mention that she hasn't already mentioned?
Oh, wow. Well, pop-up supper clubs and kind of invite-only supper clubs are really big. And the thing about the invite-only, they're not like exclusive. I mean, you just get on a mailing list and eventually they'll tell you when you can come. So in other words, you sort of have to leave your calendar free for a lot of these. And they'll just sort of say, hey, we're doing our next thing Thursday, September 25th or something. You're like, oh, dang, okay, I forgot I was on this list. I signed up 9 months ago to eat here, and now I've got to come to this. That's a big deal. Because just like even my book, there's chefs like Craig Thornton, for example. He used to run a dinner called Wolf's Mouth, and what he would do is he would sort of look through the people that wanted to eat there and choose his guests for the night with an eye towards variety. So given the demand for food there and the demand for interesting culinary creations with chefs like Craig. He was able to do that. So that's one trend that's successful in a city that large because of the amount of foodies and the demand for that kind of experience. That said, I mentioned this earlier too, like sour beers are it's been really popular in the beer community there for quite a while. And what else? Oh yeah, people are doing, cider, of course, and then food-wise, I see the trends in food being more kind of structural as opposed to based around particular ingredients or like trends with. I mean, certainly like the evolving seasonal menu is very common there, but has been for a long time. Like the largest recent change I see is the growth of these supper clubs, and this kind of Byzantine entry into like restaurant and dining experiences. I recently went to a restaurant in Los Angeles called Trois Mecs. It's a French restaurant. It's in an old pizza place called Raffalos. They didn't change the sign. It's in a strip mall. Many of Los Angeles' best restaurants are in strip malls, like next to a laundromat or an old video store. And this one is no different. There's an old, beat-up old sign that says Raffalos Pizza, and all the windows, like all the shades are down. You can't see what's inside. You'd have to know that there is an extremely exclusive French restaurant in here. And that's part of the appeal, Yeah, we had to make that reservation like months in advance. And then even then, like you just get what he's making, like a lot of the places are, omakase style. So you go in, you just sit down and like, this is what we have, this is what you're getting. You can decide whether or not to have a wine pairing with each course, because maybe you're not a drinker. And that's it, that's your choice. Like you can have wine with it or not. But I thought it was great. That said, it's a little expensive and it's not going to be more than a once a year type of thing, no. Yeah, and sometimes like I do see that sign and I go, I kind of want pizza actually.
Yeah, I guess Ryan and Beth, this has been so much fun tonight, so thank you so much for being here. And I guess this is more just a sort of something a little bit to add to what we were talking about in terms of memoirs, and even I think the question over here on thinking about why breweries are so successful and what that model is compared to different, even farmers or even small food businesses or producers. So the one thing on memoirs, I recently saw this man, he was the most amazing man. His name is Michael A. Twitty. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he is an African-American Jewish gay man. And he has a blog called Afro Culinaria, and it is the most beautiful blog. If you can all go check it out, it's amazing. And he really talks about something called identity cooking, and he's tracing his roots, from East Africa all the way back, and talking about how we express these complex identities through our food and through cooking. And it's really beautiful, so I totally recommend that if you can see it. But the one thing that I've been thinking about that, and this is something we've been talking about all night, is he talks about, how we express our spiritual and cultural values through our plate or through what we drink. And I think there's something about, when Katie was talking about the breweries, I think, beer is just something that, especially in the United States, it's just, we celebrate it so much, it's just, it brings us together, like, not, it doesn't bring us together like wine does or other drinks. There's something about beer that's just, it brings us together. So I think that's really interesting. But in thinking about, going back to like how our cultural food system, we really went to of course we went to sort of our farming culture to an industrialized food system, right? So talking about General Mills, we really live within those confines. We live in this sort of corporate community. And I think that I think there's this really interesting intersection that we are now where the small farms, the small businesses, the small producers, to a certain extent really do have to play with those big players, or we really do as a community have to come out and really, really strongly support those small people as we do breweries of all types, whether they're good or bad, right? So it's just a sort of a fascinating way, I think, especially in Minnesota, when we do have such an amazing farming and sustainable food culture and system here, we also have General Mills, right? So it's an interesting parallel that I think is just really thinking about how we are now expressing that big and small at the same time. So
I just want to add, that's what makes this area so remarkable, because we really hold the world's fertility. We've been the breadbasket of the world, ever since this area was settled. And so you're absolutely right, because what we've seen over, the period of time that this region has emerged is both and it really came to a head right after World War II, but both the industrial food system and the organic food system kind of growing up side by side. And I think it's really vibrant here. And even though it may feel as though the smaller system is living under the shadow of the larger system, I think it's pretty vibrant. And Fred Kirschner, who's a writer, he's a minister and an organic farmer, will say that that's what we need to do, is we need to grow the kind of resilience that's going on with these small entrepreneurial food businesses and breweries and cideries and things like that. So thank you. It's a nice comment.
Yeah, I have one last thing to say. Yeah, if anyone has any suggestions for me on additional resources or places I should explore, I'm always trying to learn. Like, the more I get into researching this stuff, the more I realize how much I just don't know how much, the mountains of information, places and resources and helpful people that are out there. So either talk to me afterwards or send me an email. My email address is on my website. I'd love to hear about things that are exciting you in breweries or in food. Also, I just got back from a book tour in Germany and the German-speaking countries, and I have 3 German language editions of my book up at the desk that I'll give away for free to anybody who speaks German or knows someone who does, who might want a German translation of my book. It's my pleasure to hand them out. I got a box of them, and I thought, oh man, I can't, I'll bring some to Minnesota. Maybe some Minnesotans might know a German speaker, or might speak German, or might appreciate it. So they're yours if you want them. And I just want to say thank you again for coming out on a cold Thursday night and fighting through Vikings traffic to be with us tonight.
Thank you so much. This is great. Thank you. Thank you.
So your request for where you should go for more information, how you get insight, how you find more resources, there's a lot of us who would have one answer to that, which is go to your library.
Oh, yeah.
But I truly want to thank both of you. We have a little gift bag of Friends of the Library goodies. I can tell by the weight it's not books, so you'll get to look in a minute. Hope the rest of you will all join us out in the atrium for dessert reception. We also have books for sale from both our authors, and they're willing to do autographs. So again, thank you for coming. Hope we'll see you at the next Friends Forum. Have a good evening.